Herzlich willkommen. Very warm welcome to everyone. For the last presentation, what's the name of your presentation? Food Diversity and Deliciousness by Josh Evans from the Nordic Food Lab.
Thank you. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see you. I never wear my glasses, so this is a really big deal for me. Don't make fun of me. So my name's Josh, and I'm the lead researcher at Nordic Food Lab in Copenhagen. And this is my colleague right here, This is Roberto. He's our head chef. We're here together. Yeah? And we just ran a workshop for about an hour and a half with 30 people who are really interested in learning more about what we do. And we ran through a bunch of things that we brought from Copenhagen to smell and taste. And unfortunately, we can't do that with you right now. But instead, I can talk a little bit more about what we do and why we do it. And there's going to be one thing that we can taste all together to sort of give an illustration of that. So maybe some of you are aware of what Nordic Food Lab is, and maybe some of you aren't. So really briefly, I'll give a really simple description. Nordic Food Lab, we are a non-profit organization, and we're really small. And we do open source research into the raw materials and the techniques of the Nordic region to try and broaden the foods that we use on a daily basis through taste. So our focus is always on what we call deliciousness, which is sort of a favorite word of the chef of restaurant Noma, which maybe some of you have heard of. And he was the one who set up Nordic Food Lab originally in 2008 for this purpose. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is horseradish. And this is sort of where the start of Nordic Food Lab is. Because René, the chef of Noma, was trying to make a dish with horseradish. And every time he got some wild horseradish in from the foragers, it tasted completely different. Sometimes it was really sweet, sometimes it was intensely bitter, sometimes it was very, very pungent, and he would be crying for like 10 minutes after slicing it up. And sometimes it would be very delicate and almost floral. And he had no idea why. There was no way to predict what the horseradish would taste like. And so at some point, he got in contact with a botanist in Copenhagen. And he asked, I'm trying to work with this horseradish, and it's always different. I can't tell why. And the botanist said, well, of course, because there's at least 150 different species of wild horseradish in Denmark. And the way that René tells the story, that was a moment for him where he had this sort of small revelation where that's the sort of knowledge that as a chef, as a cook in the kitchen, you have to have if you want to be working with these products. But at the same time, if you're a chef working in a very ambitious restaurant for 16 hours a day, you don't necessarily have the time or the energy to go to the library after work at 2 in the morning and read up on why this might be the case, or to talk to experts at 3 in the afternoon when everyone else is at work. So he created the space so different chefs and researchers and scientists could come together to try and identify these questions and produce knowledge that would be useful to people who cook food and who like to eat, which is, I guess, at least all of us here. Can you go to the next slide, please? This is where we are. We're on a boat in Copenhagen Harbor. We're on a houseboat right outside the restaurant. It's a very nice place to work. And before I launch into a couple of examples of what we do, I want to briefly explain the title of the talk, which was Food Diversity and Deliciousness. We've talked a bit about deliciousness and why it's important to René, and also how it guides a lot of our work. People often ask us, so do you mean that it's this principle that's discoverable in things, that there are certain foods that are delicious and certain foods that aren't? And that's really not what it's about, because we all know that our genes, our cultural upbringing, what our parents fed us, what our parents didn't feed us, all of these things have a huge bearing on what we individually see as tasty or not. And really it comes down to that. It's that embodied, subjective experience of pleasure and nourishment that we're always trying to pursue and trying to push and trying to understand better so that we can make more delicious food available to more people. The other side of it is the food diversity. And I see them as really related to each other. And this is sort of the core of what I want to talk to you about really briefly today, is when we talk about sustainability, for example, it's not just a function of how much greenhouse gases something emits or how far away it's transported from. It's also a function of how that food was produced, the sort of system that the food emerges out of. And what we find is a lot of the most sustainable systems are sustainable because they're resilient. They can adapt to conditions that change, often in unexpected ways. And when you have that resilience and you have that adaptability, that's what produces a food system that can be robust, that can perpetuate itself into the future. And what's really exciting for us at the lab is that a lot of the time we end up stumbling upon this diversity in the pursuit of tasty things. Because if we find something really delicious, let's say, a classic example being a beautiful lobe of foie gras, which is like very luxurious, high-end ingredient. That might be really delicious for some people, but it would be really hard for someone who loves foie gras to eat foie gras for every meal, for every day of the rest of their life. Maybe someone could, but very few people. And so when we're talking about something being delicious, a big part of that is embracing different things in our diet that we find delicious. And the more that we're able to embrace that diversity and explore that diversity, the more that our diets actually can lead us to that resilient food system that we're really trying to, together create. And so I want to take you through a couple of examples of the work that we do and try and tie them into that idea about how looking at a lot of neglected and underutilized food resources, trying to discover how they can be delicious to us, how we can take them from being maybe something that isn't considered edible at all, or maybe something that used to be food for people but has been forgotten, like organ meats or wild plants. How by pursuing their potential for deliciousness, we can actually bring them back into our diets, make our diets more diverse, and as a result, make them lead to a more resilient food system. So could you go to the next slide, please, and we'll get started. This is like all of the things in our drawers put up into our window. I really like this photograph. It's one of my favorite photographs because it really illustrates what we try and do, where a lot of these things, aren't really clear what they are, and there's lots of different colors and textures, and maybe not all of them are delicious yet, because most of what we do is based in experimentation, and that means that a lot of things fail, actually, which is just as important to the process. But nonetheless, it really illustrates sort of the range of different things that we're trying to make able to give people that sense of deliciousness. Could you go to the next slide? One of the first projects that the lab started doing back in 2009 when it was founded was looking at seaweeds. Because there's not really any robust tradition of eating seaweeds in the Nordic region that we know of, at least. A couple scattered accounts, but nothing really. And on the one hand, you have that. And on the other hand, you have hundreds and hundreds of different species of seaweeds, many of which are indigenous to the Baltic Sea and the North Atlantic, that have a lot of potential when it comes to flavor and umami taste, that feeling of savoriness, and also texture, and we're just not using them. And in many cases, they're very easy to grow. They grow very quickly. They can grow in many different types of environments. And so we started saying, this is a huge resource that has a lot of potential for deliciousness, but also potential for nutrition, for a new source of protein, for different micronutrients. We really need to be exploring this. So we looked to other cultures in the world, in East Asia and Southeast Asia and different places, where seaweeds have a really strong culinary tradition, where they're a delicacy, and started being inspired by that and then trying to figure out different ways that we could bring that knowledge into the context into the geographic context of where we are. So these are a few of the different species. And could you go to the next slide? So one of the things that's really interesting is texture. A lot of the hydrocolloids that we use in kitchens and also in industrial food production, like agar and iota and carrageenan, to make gels and to thicken sauces and things like this, many of them come from seaweeds originally. And so we thought to ourselves, why can't we try and make these products ourselves to understand how the process works, and then make it, instead of making it be this sort of exotic, misunderstood food product, have it be something that's actually very accessible to people, that people can try out in their own home kitchens too. So this is gracilaria, which is a type of seaweed. The next slide. And this is what it looks like after it's been bleached in the sun, which is a part of the process. Can you go to the next slide? And then after bleaching it, we cook it in a pressure cooker and then cool that down and dehydrate it. And this is a gel made from the homemade agar, which is pretty similar to what a gel would look like if you use industrial agar. And doing something simple like this, where all you need is a pressure cooker, which is increasingly a common thing that people have in their kitchen, can not only give us access to all of these wild resources that are all around us, but can also lessen our reliance on a lot of these industrial food products that aren't necessarily being produced in a responsible way, aren't necessarily something that we want to be investing our time and energy in. Could you go to the next slide? This is one of my favorite seaweeds. It's called dulse. It's a red algae. And this is one of the seaweeds that has so much versatility in the kitchen. It has incredible umami taste. It has flavors like licorice and berries and tea. You can use it in savory contexts. You can use it in sweet contexts. And in the next slide, you'll see an ice cream made from this seaweed. And it's a really great way to introduce people to an ingredient that they might not have any relationship with. And for a lot of people, seaweeds are very sort of scary and maybe disgusting. And a lot of the time, that's because most people only have a relationship with seaweed as something that's rotting on the beach. When you go for a walk on the beach and it's sort of like drying and there's flies on it and it smells kind of gross. And we sort of talk about that as if you were to go into an orchard in the fall and only pay attention to the apples that are rotting on the ground and not look up into the tree to see the beautiful ripe apples that are ready for you to pick. And so by taking a seaweed that has been harvested really well, that we've aged for a long time to break it down and bring out that savory quality, bring out those aromas, and then make it into something like ice cream, which most people have a familiarity with and most people really love, it can be a fantastic way of taking something novel and introducing it into a familiar context. And that can be sort of, we call it like a gateway food, a way for people to start to form a relationship with an ingredient that might otherwise be really novel, but in this context can be something that starts to become familiar. Could you go to the next slide? So once we started looking to seaweeds, we realized that there were way more other products in the ocean that we weren't tapping into at all. And this is a jellyfish, and we started working on jellyfish this summer because there were a lot of jellyfish floating around our boat, and we had one of our interns from South Korea, where in East Asia and in Southeast Asia there's a really strong gastronomic tradition of using jellyfish in different preparations. And so we sort of said, well, why aren't we investigating if we can eat this, and then how can we make this tasty to people? This is a moon jellyfish. It's quite small, but it's not toxic, and that was one of the species that we started working with. Can you go to the next slide? That's what it looks like close up. Yeah. It has this, as you would imagine, this really lovely texture. It's slippery and it's crunchy, and for a lot of Western people, it's a texture that isn't desirable. But that texture in a lot of other cuisines is something that's really celebrated. So we tried to figure out, how can we work with this product that for many people is a huge challenge, and try and put it into a context where it's familiar enough that they'll try it, but it's also true enough to what it is that you that it's honest, that you're celebrating it for the fact that it's a jellyfish rather than the fact that it's, had lots of something else doused on it and you're not really appreciating the quality of the jellyfish itself. Could you go to the next slide? So this is, I guess, a good example. It's a very simple preparation. There's 2 ingredients, which Roberto made. We had these jellyfish, and we were, slicing them up and playing around with loads of different combinations. And at one point, we were like, OK, let's just be really simple about it. So we diced up some jellyfish, sort of in like that size. And then we put a spoon over some ice so it was really cold. And the brown stuff in between is a fermented sauce made from, was it fish sauce or was it grasshopper garum? Yeah, it was a fermented sauce made from grasshoppers, which is made in the style of a fish sauce. So using salt and using a molded grain, you combine that with the grasshoppers, and then it breaks down into this really rich, dark umami sauce, which sort of tastes like soy sauce, but also has these notes from the grasshoppers, these really fruity, nutty notes that you don't really get from anything else. And it was a really simple preparation, and giving it to people who had never eaten jellyfish for the first time was a way of making it tasty and sort of opening up that whole other area of possibility when it comes to new foods. Could you go to the next slide, please? This is another simple preparation we did, a little thin slice of jellyfish, and wrapped around that is a thin slice of radish that's been compressed in kimchi juice, and then a stem of nasturtium. And again, really simple, but very fresh, and really celebrates that crunchy, slightly salty, and very surprisingly refreshing taste of the jellyfish. The next slide. Could you go to the next slide, please? And then this was a dish we developed that used some of the white kimchi broth that the same intern was working on. And we were sort of playing with this to try and mimic the shape of the jellyfish, to sort of represent what the jellyfish looks like when it's floating in the sea outside of our houseboat. So this was made from a couple turnips thinly sliced, and the small ones in the middle, a couple of radishes that were compressed in this kimchi juice. And then we compressed them together, draped them with a thin layer of the jellyfish so it had that same texture, and then put it into a broth that was made from a diluted version of this white kimchi juice. Kimchi is a type of pickle from South Korea. So those are some examples of what we did with jellyfish, which are sort of fresh in our minds because we were just doing it this summer. Could you go to the next slide? And while we're talking about stuff from the sea, which is sort of a theme, I guess, we really have to talk about fish sauce. We're really in love with umami taste. And some of you probably know about umami taste. It's a Japanese word that refers to this concept, this sensation of savoriness, of something being really, really mouth-coating. It's sort of, you find it in aged cheeses and cured meats, tomatoes, soy sauce, a lot of these different products that are used to really amp up the savory profile of foods. So that's been a really big passion of ours for the last few years, and we're always trying to find new sources of that. The seaweeds at the beginning are a huge, diverse source of that. And fermentation is another technique that we can use to take otherwise really simple ingredients like grains and beans and the guts of fish and the trimmings from other types of meat, combine them, and then wait some more, and then after a few months, we're left with this very rich, concentrated, savory sauce. So fish sauce is a perfect example of that, where it has a very old tradition. It goes back thousands of years in certain areas of the world. The ancient Romans called it garum, which is where our grasshopper garum comes from. And they put it on everything. And they had all different types of it. It was this real gastronomic thing that they valued so much. And so we were like, we should try and investigate that technique too. So we took a lot of fish guts, which are the best part for fermenting because they're already full of all the bacteria and all of the enzymes that you want that will break it down much more quickly. You add some salt to prevent the growth of unwanted molds. And then sometimes you can add some koji, which is a molded grain the tradition is based in East Asia also, which speeds up the fermentation and adds more enzymes and adds some sweetness and some body. And then you just wait. You keep it warm for the first few weeks. And then eventually, you come up with this fantastic product that you can use in lots of different contexts. Could you go to the next photo? These are some of the fish we started with. These are some herring. Next photo. And this is the koji I was talking about earlier. In this case, we're growing the mold on barley. And we use that as the basis for a lot of our fermentations because it allows us to add in like a whole other dose of enzymes which can speed up the fermentation, and also add in all of these other volatile molecules that add this other layer of aromatic complexity, which makes it really tasty. Can you go to the next photo? So this is the ugly photo. I really like it because you can see all of the bones and the heads of the fish. This is what it looks like probably after a few months of fermenting, and we pour it off and we filter out all of the particulate matter, all of the bones, and you're left with this very beautiful, clear liquid. Should you go to the next photo? This is the pretty version. It's also nice, but different. And the next photo. And that's what it looks like when you filter it. So much more pretty, much more pure, and can be used in lots of different contexts. So we have a taste right now that we're going to pass out. And it's not the fish sauce, but it's the grasshopper garum that I talked about earlier. So it's a very similar technique. We have salt and we have koji, but instead of using fish guts, we use grasshoppers. And the reason for this isn't novelty. It's not shock value. It's because you can take the same technique and apply it to lots of different things, in this case, something that's rich in protein, and the result will be really different. So we're passing a few cups around, and maybe you can keep passing them along, and it's in a pipette, so take a pipette, and you can just sort of squeeze it into your mouth like that. If anyone's allergic to shellfish, grasshoppers can be cross-allergenic with shellfish because of the chitin, so you can try it, but eat it at your own risk. I can't be responsible for you, unfortunately. So give it a try, and I hope you like it. And if you don't, that's also cool, and let me know. Good. And maybe afterwards, if you have questions about it, we can talk about it more. But again, this sort of thing, the ingredients are quite simple. It mainly just takes time, and the applications of it are incredibly versatile. Yeah. Could you go to the next slide, please? So yeah, those are the whole grasshoppers that we start with. And could you go to the next slide? And that's what it looks like when we're fermenting it in the chamber. We keep it in these glass beakers, and then we keep it warm inside of a thermal box. The next slide. And that's the recipe. And you can find the recipe also on our website if you're interested. Next slide. I'm sorry, I'm saying next slide because we don't have a clicker. We're going to talk about this really quickly because I want to have time for questions too. But I'll talk about this really quickly. So this is from a beehive, as you can probably tell from the structure of it. But it's not honey in there. It's bee larvae. It's the young of the bees. And this is another insect that's really local for us. And you can find really high quality stuff, but is a waste product in many cases. It's something that beekeepers in Denmark often throw away because it's removed from hives over the summer as a strategy to combat the varroa mite, which is this little parasite that you find in a lot of beehives nowadays, and increasingly many, that attack the bees. They specifically target the drones, which are the males. And the reason for this is because the males have a slightly longer developmental stage than the workers, which are female. And if the beekeepers remove the drones in a systematic way throughout the summer, then they can really reduce the population of these mites, because all the mites are attracted to the males because they are the longest source of food that they have. And so this is a strategy that beekeepers will use to keep the populations low. But once they remove them, they throw them away or they give them to the chickens, which is also fine because chicken is tasty. But we saw this happening, and we asked ourselves, why can't we use this for something? We should at least be tasting it to see what it tastes like. And I'll always remember the first time I tasted it, because when you have it, especially straight from the hive, it's still warm. And they're very, very soft. And they're very fatty. They're 50% protein and 20 to 25% fat. And you put them in your tongue, and they yield to your mouth very softly, and they sort of rupture like caviar. And they're very fatty, and they coat your mouth, and they taste, like honey, they can taste like herbs or flowers or fruits or wax or nuts or all these different flavors depending on where the bees are taking the honey from or the nectar, what time of the year it is, when in the season it is. And so the potential for gastronomic application of that is huge. And so we started working with them. So I'll briefly take you through a couple of things we did with them. Next slide. That's what they look like when they're out of the comb. We mainly like to use the white ones because they're at the younger stage and they're more palatable. Next slide. This is a really simple granola we developed, which is like oats and nuts and seeds that instead of coating with oil and sugar, we coat with bee larvae blended up with honey because they're so high in fat and protein. And then we coat them with that and then roast it. And it's not like a fine dining recipe. It's not something that can or should be served at Noma. That's not the point. The point is a recipe that is really familiar to people, that's very simple and easy to make, that can be used and made in a kitchen at home, that can start to make these sorts of ingredients accessible to people. The next slide. And this is another very simple preparation. This is bee larvae prepared like a ceviche. Ceviche is this dish from South and Central America originally, where people cure seafood with acid. And the acid cooks the protein and coagulates them. It's the same process that happens when you apply heat to the protein, but you're not applying heat, you're applying an acidic compound. And so we sort of were like, oh, the bee larvae sort of have this like soft texture like roe, for example, like fish eggs. Maybe we can use a similar ceviche technique on it. So we did a ceviche with rhubarb vinegar, some oxalis stems, some lemon thyme, some freeze-dried lingonberries, and it was sort of this very bright floral and herbal take on a South American technique, using these very local, very delicious ingredients. Yeah. Next slide, please. And this is just one really quick thing we did when we were on fieldwork in Denmark. We were investigating another type of insect, and our host had kept bees. And this was in July, so she was removing the bee larvae. And we said, oh, can we take some of those and use them? She's like, yeah, okay. And sort of looked at us weirdly. But she gave them to us, and she had this huge lovage plant. I don't know what lovage is in German. It's an herb. It's sort of similar to celery, but it's very, very strong aromatic flavor. And when the stems go to seed, you have these really thick stems that are hollow. So Roberto and I looked at each other, and we were like, OK, we need to use the lovage. So we took the hollow stem, you can see there, and filled it with bee larvae, and then boiled it really briefly, just to set the bee larvae so they became a bit firmer. And we had some jasmine flowers in there to add that floral fragrance, and the lovage flavor came in from the stem. Next slide. You can see the stem and the hollowness there. And in the next slide, you can see what it looks like when it's opened up. And they've sort of firmed up in there, and they have, again, this like really lovely, custardy, caviar sort of texture. And this very lovely, delicate, floral, herbal flavor. And that's something we're sort of trying to take back to the lab and apply and refine further. Next slide, please. So why am I talking about all of this? And I sort of want to close, before we go to some questions, by reiterating how some of these techniques and ideas can lead us to our vision, which I think a lot of us share, for a more sustainable food system. And what is the role of taste in that? What can the role of deliciousness be, more than just as sort of an afterthought, more than something that we only see as a luxury that certain people can have, and the rest of us have to make do with subsisting on food, where food is primarily about sustenance and not pleasure? What can actually what can pleasure actually bring to the table? Next slide. So if we start at a place of deliciousness, as I talked about in the beginning, that can actually, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of the time, it can lead us to having more food diversity. Next slide. And when we have that food diversity in our diets, where we're being open to new tastes, we're trying to find out how different sources of food can bring new flavors into our kitchens, can allow us to have more diverse, more specific expressions of our creative process and our pursuit of deliciousness, that leads to other types of diversity. Next slide. It leads to diversity in our ecology, because if we're wanting to have more different ingredients in our kitchen, that has to be traced back out to where we're getting the food from. In the farm, in the land, in the sea. And when we have that diversity, when we're relying on more things to feed ourselves, we rely on each of those things less. And this is a very well-known idea that actually monoculture is often one of the most destructive forms of producing food for ourselves, whether that's in an agricultural system, whether that's over-harvesting of a wild ingredient. When we embrace diversity in our diets and on our tables, that diversity can have a really powerful impact when it translates into where that food is coming from, how we're thinking about the larger system, the larger ecology of the food before it becomes an ingredient in our cooking. Next slide. And as I started getting at the beginning, and what I'd like to argue and what I'd like to continue the conversation about is that that diversity in ecology is the foundation for sustainability, because it is what embodies and what manifests resilience. It is where we get food systems that if one crop fails, we have 10 or 20 others. If one pest comes in on something, the other ones will regulate it. If we're thinking about food production in the farm and also in the kitchen as a system with different interacting parts, that's where real sustainability can happen. And what we're really interested in at Nordic Food Lab is trying to map out the ways that pursuing deliciousness can actually lead us to that, rather than trying to use other arguments like ethical arguments, nutrition arguments, sustainability arguments. If we can use the gastronomic argument, which is what we call it, sort of saying, you should eat this because it's delicious, rather than saying you should eat this because it's high in protein or because it's going to save the world, which often is way more complicated than that. If we can start from a place of, this is really delicious, it has a unique flavor, it adds something new to our tables, let's start there and see how that can have an impact on how we feed ourselves and how we feed each other. I think that can be a really powerful idea for the world. So thank you very much. You can go to the next slide, it's the end. And that's our contact info if you want to get in touch. And I want to invite Roberto up onto the stage. If you have any questions, we can try and answer them together. And yeah, thank you very much for your time. Here. Hello. Hi. So I'll get a mic. If I turn this on, is it going to work?
We can share.
OK, we can share. Does anybody have any questions? Did I speak too quickly?
No, that's fine.
No one? OK. Does anybody have any question? No? That's also cool. Yeah, OK, good. Yeah? Just use, oh, OK. Thank you. We need to get you a microphone, though. Don't we? OK. Is it not working? Here, you use this one.
Hello. Yes. Okay. First question.
Hi, my name is Anna.
Hi, Anna.
Thanks for the talk. And I have a question because you showed a lot of kind of success stories to us. But I'm pretty sure that in your everyday work, you have a lot of failed experiments.
Yes.
And I would like to know, I don't know, tell us more about what you considered maybe edible, but which was a complete toss. I don't know, it was not edible or it was just disgusting. I would like to know more about
Yes,
this
so most things that we do fail. And that's just the nature of experimenting, is that you sort of just have to go by trial and error. And if you stumble upon something that has promise, then you pursue it. And oftentimes, actually, we learn more from when things fail, because they start to gesture towards what's actually happening. Like if it's a fermentation, for example, like the grasshopper garum that you tried, that isn't the first recipe that we tried. If we make a version that goes sour, like way too sour, maybe that's because we didn't have enough salt. Or if we have a version that's way too sweet or ferments way too quickly, maybe that's because we had too much koji. Or maybe the koji itself had a problem in it if it goes like ammoniated. And so when we have failures, what we call, we can call it failure, but often it's just that it hasn't succeeded yet. When we have something like that, it can actually indicate to us which direction we should move in. So, I guess a good example would be a lot of these long-term fermented sauces like the garum, where even though you only have like 3 or sometimes 4 ingredients, all of the variables of temperature and time and microbial ecology and whether you inoculate it or not, all of these things, to understand how all of those work together, we need to try a lot of different versions and then see how they differ over time.
And also, we have a big range of disgusting, because sometimes tastes strange. This is weird. Maybe we know.
Maybe it's tasty.
So it's really.
Yeah, it's often a lot of like looking around, and that's why we all have to taste things together, because we all have different tastes. Like I'm from Western Canada, Roberto's from Italy. We have people from Denmark and England and South Korea and Finland and all over, and everyone has different taste. But when we taste all the things together, often that can be like if most of us think it's delicious, then we feel like we're onto something. But as you rightly guess, most of the time, it doesn't happen the first time. So it's a question of persistence, and that's when it's a question of also of, going to experts who know way more about it than we do. Because we're not experts really in anything that we do. We know a little bit about a lot of things, but there's always someone who knows way more than us. So for fermenting stuff, working with microbiologists who have a really good understanding of the microbes involved, of how the different metabolisms are taking place, that knowledge can help us when we go back into the kitchen to say, okay, we have a hunch of how this works. We understand this a bit better. Maybe we can, take it further. But it's always a process. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Who else has a question?
Okay. With all this food from the ocean you showed us in the first slides, what about all the plastics in the ocean? We are using too much plastic bags. We're using one-way coffee-to-go cups. Are you addressing this as well?
It's not specifically our mandate, because, our primary mandate is to pursue delicious things. But as you say, of course it's connected. If our oceans are being destroyed, are being overfished and being overpolluted, and there's tons of runoff from poor agricultural practices. And sometimes if we can actually focus on finding something really tasty, that often comes from an area of the ocean that is in really good condition. And if we can create a demand for that, then there becomes an extra incentive to preserve that environment if it gives rise to something really delicious, which is another good example, I think, of where if you're focusing on really the best tasting thing, that's going to come from an ocean that's clean, that isn't overfished, that has an ecology happening in it. But as to whether we work directly with trying to reduce plastic in the ocean, unfortunately, no. But it also comes to a point where like everywhere nowadays has some sort of taint to it. It's really hard to find like truly pristine environment anymore. So we do the best we can, basically. But of course, the focus is always on sourcing the best things that we can source.
The jellyfish is a clear example of pollution of oceans and overfishing, because it's becoming an invasive species. Yeah. Also because we are fishing a lot of natural predators from jellyfish. So
yeah, that's a good point to bring up. Is that the reason why we started working with jellyfish was because we saw it around more and more, and then we started looking into it, and the first thing we found was that it's becoming a lot of these species are becoming really invasive in the North Atlantic and the Baltic, and because of this really imbalanced marine ecology.
And And the first person who is affected is the fisherman, because the nets for the fishers is breaked from the weight of the jellyfish. So it's also...
So the best thing we can do is to try and eat the jellyfish, basically, from our point of view. Yeah. Was there another question? Back
Yeah,
here.
I have the microphone. Is it on? Yeah. So my name is Ines. Hi.
Hi.
I already had the pleasure to listen to a talk from your dear colleague Tom Reed this year, and I was also able to try some funny insect dishes.
Where was that?
That was at the Film Food Festival.
Okay, yeah, cool.
Yeah. So I was wondering, how many guys are you at the Nordic Food Lab, and what is your education? Because so you introduced your colleague as a chef, but what's the background of you guys?
Okay, well, we're really small. We have a full-time team of 3 people, which is actually really new. For a long time, we were only 2. For a long time, it was me and Ben. And then Ben left us in June. And that's when Roberto came on as head chef. So we have Roberto as our head chef, and my title is lead researcher, and I've been there for 2.5 years. And then our third full-time guy is named Jonas, and he's a Dane. And he has a background in food science and technology. And then we have anywhere from like 1 to 5 or 6 interns, depending on the season and what projects are happening and stuff like that. And interns usually stay for anywhere from 3 months to a year, yeah, depending on what happens. My background in food is in sustainable agriculture and food systems. And the more that I was growing things and teaching people about growing things, the more I realized how important cooking was, because I can grow you a really nice carrot, but if you're 6 years old and a really picky eater, if we can't like find a way to make that carrot really appealing to you, and then it's not going to have nearly as much impact as it would than if we did. So cooking is this really important, cooking and gastronomy in general, gastronomy in the broader sense, the knowledge about how we feed ourselves, is really important when it comes to transforming food systems, because it's not enough to just have really good farming practices and really good sourcing practices. It also has to be about the knowledge that we use to make that into nourishing food for people. So sort of the lab seemed to me a really fantastic and unique place to investigate how those connections work with each other. But we come from all different backgrounds. I mean, Roberto studied agronomy.
I'm basically, I have a really deep imprinting with food when I was young, because I grew with my grandma, is really classic, say, for an Italian.
So Italian.
Yeah, it's real. And yeah, basically, I ever feel I want to become a chef when I was bigger, like older. And when I have decided my studies, I start to study agronomy, because I was really curious about the product of the chefs using the plates. So I grow up with the like family food imprint. I'm study agronomy, and then I'm select my maestro for starting working as a chef. And yeah.
So we have, I mean, some of us are trained cooks. Some of us are like, have loved cooking but have different expertise. Like, I'm not trained as a restaurant chef. And some of us, come from really other backgrounds, like, I don't know, filmmaking or philanthropy or design or all sorts of things. But the common thread that runs through it is that we all really love eating. And we love cooking. And that's sort of what it's about.
Emotion.
It's the most important thing. Yeah. Thanks for your question. Does anyone else have a question? Yeah, in the front. Oh, you.
Can I
Sorry. Wait. Yeah. Hi.
Oh, a quick question, and then I'll pass the mic on.
Okay.
I wonder about your presence in the city as the small, beautiful boat. How
in Copenhagen, you mean?
In Copenhagen, yeah, exactly. Like you mentioned the collaboration with Noma, and you mentioned you have tastings together and all this stuff. Do you do stuff for like the public? How accessible are you?
We try more and more. I mean, it's always a balance between research and dissemination, because a lot of the time they're both very necessary, but the conditions that you need for each are very different. For research, we really need to have a closed space where we have a lot of control and we have like long, uninterrupted stretches of time, a lot of the time. And for dissemination, it's really important to welcome people in, be an open space where we also have this, where we go out into the city, where we have this sort of permeability. And so sometimes, we do a lot of workshops where we bring people in, and also we travel a lot around the world in Denmark, giving talks, doing workshops, like we're doing here. But more and more, like reaching out to our local community is really important. So, the seaweed ice cream I showed you, a couple summers ago, we started going around with a bike that was built with a chamber inside that was specifically designed, we could like go around and serve ice cream to people on the streets to say, hey, like, do you want to try some seaweed? Maybe in a form that's tasty, to sort of start that process. It's not just enough for us to develop ideas. More and more, I think, we're really committed to trying to find ways to implement them, to try and find ways to get them directly to people, and then also try to find partners who can take that on and then develop it further. So people who can like put products into production, people who can continue to spread that knowledge and spread the actual food.
Sometimes people think some process is weird, but only because maybe doesn't know how approach like a fermentation can be an example, and we try to make to explain how approach, and also how can like break this kind of wall between really technical and technical kitchen preparation and try
just
to
how
do,
to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. We're here. Hi.
Hello. Hello? Hello? Yes?
Yeah.
Inspiring, thank you. How do you sustain the project?
Like financially?
Everything.
It's a big question. Well, financially, we're a nonprofit, and we're funded from a variety of sources, and that's always changing. A lot of it's project-based, so we receive research grants that we apply for from, a lot of the time, different private foundations that fund different projects. Sometimes we also receive similar funding from private businesses if they're really interested in what we do, and maybe we'll do a collaboration with them on something. And then sometimes, but not so much anymore, but in the beginning we received some government seed money, I believe, to get the project started. So it's sort of a mix. Yeah. The question is, there's no production aspect. You mean like commercial production of things that we make and sell? Or? We haven't done that much in the past, and the main reason is that it often requires a whole other set of infrastructure to do. But we're starting to get into that. And our first thing that we're starting with is a gin that's distilled primarily with ants. Because the ants bring this really lovely, this brings this really lovely like spice. The ants themselves are quite sour and lemony, but when you distill them, they take on this sort of like spicy, herbal, very powerful quality to them. So we think it's really special, and we developed it originally for an event last year, and there was a really positive response. So we're working with a distillery in the UK called Cambridge Distillery, and the gin is called Anti-Gin, and it's actually, I think, just going to be released like in the next month or two.
200 bottles.
Yeah, stay tuned. But that's, again, an example where we have the sort of the knowledge and the expertise, but not the infrastructure to produce it, so we partner with someone who can help us produce it.
But is one of our point, maybe start to looking also in collaboration with companies, small companies maybe, or
again,
wherever.
In order to get it out to more people. Yeah. Were there more questions? How are we for time? One more question.
Hi. Hello? Hi.
Hi.
Well, thank you, first of all. And then my question would be, how do you know that all those different species, for example, the jellyfish, that they aren't dangerous, I mean, if you just
like
go
to
out,
eat?
Yeah. Like, because there aren't any traditional recipes or anything for it, so how would you know?
It's a good question.
So in really exist, we start work also with the jellyfish because Yangwin was the girl who was starting the research with jellyfish comes from a place where jellyfish is normal to use it in diets. So basically we start to looking in disease in jellyfish, or possibility disease in jellyfish, and which kind of available jellyfish we have in the Baltic Sea. And then we contact some experts from like ocean researchers and for asking more, and yeah.
But I think in general, like there's no one way, there's no one method. It really depends on what it is. But a lot of the time it involves consulting people who, again, people who know way more about it than we do. So if it's a wild plant, oh, there's no cable. If it's a wild plant, consulting with foragers and people who have herbal knowledge, and also toxicologists. In the case of the jellyfish, we worked a lot with marine biologists, people at the local aquarium. And that's a common theme, is like consulting sources of knowledge, whether they're people or scientific papers or books that delve more into that expert knowledge. But another part of it is, once you're sure that it's not, like edibility and deliciousness are bound up in each other. Because edibility isn't just a matter of being toxic, it's also that sociocultural aspect of, for example, is this rotten or fermented? Is this a weed or a wild plant? Like, that's not a botanical or a physiological characteristic, that's a cultural characteristic. And so finding the way, as soon as we know that it won't kill us, basically, or give us a deathly parasite, then we can start to enter that gray zone of, okay, maybe this isn't edible to people here and now, but what can we do to bring it into the category of the edible by making it tasty? And in that sense, deliciousness can actually become prior to something being edible rather than being posterior to it. But also, like, just another comment on toxicology, it's often a matter of dose and also a matter of preparation. So a lot of wild plants, like wild plants and domestic herbs, have compounds when, if you ingest them pure, they will really mess you up. Even something like basil, which is really common, has a compound called estragol in it, which if you take it pure, it's really poisonous, but you'd have to eat like 2 kilos of basil or something in an hour to like have that happen to you. So a lot of the time it's a matter of that, where you know that it contains compounds that could be dangerous, but you're never going to eat enough of it for it to be that way. And then on the other hand, you have things where there are compounds in it, but depending on how you process it, then you can render it inert. So if you boil certain types of mushrooms, for example, they can become completely safe. Or if you extract like the aroma of a plant using alcohol or oil or heat in different ways, you can either denature those toxic alkaloids, or you can remove the things that you want without removing the other things that you don't want. So that's where the kitchen knowledge is really important. And the kitchen knowledge can help us diversify our food sources. Yeah, I guess that's the last question. Thank you guys so much for coming. I hope it was interesting. I hope you liked the grasshopper garden.
Thank you so much.